All right, well, let's get going. It's a couple minutes after 4:30. Welcome again, everyone. We're really excited to have you here. We're really excited to have some special guests with us today as well. So again, my name is Megan. I'm the program manager for Advanced Learning Initiatives. So I will introduce first today our special guests. So we have with us David Yeh and also April Salas. So I'll let them introduce themselves. David, why don't you go first?
Okay, hello everyone. I'm first and foremost at Dartmouth 1994, so that's like an eon ago. And I spent most of my career as a climate professional. I've worked as an investor for Al Gore, worked at the Obama White House managing large clean energy and clean transportation programs, and also have been kind of an entrepreneur and angel investor. But I'm very, very happy to be here to hopefully share some of my experiences with my alma mater.
Great, thanks, David. And April, do you mind introducing yourself?
Yeah, not at all. Nice to see a few familiar faces, so that's really nice. I'm April Salas. I'm the Executive Director of the Tuck Revers Center for Energy, Sustainability, and Innovation. So another partner on campus doing fun work in energy, climate, and sustainability. Prior to Tuck, I spent about a decade in public service, and before that I was in energy finance consulting in the private sector, working all around the world. But I ended my tenure in the government under the Obama White House for the Secretary of Energy, and a few other really fun people to work with, but guiding and steering the Secretariat for the development of the Quadrennial Energy Review, which was really exciting. It was the nation's first attempt at really thinking about deep and comprehensive sort of systems analysis of what's going on with our state of our infrastructure, how do we align incentives, where are the gaps and what we need to focus on to make sure our infrastructure is up to date and prepared for a future, hopefully a renewable future and a climate focused future. And so, yeah, so I'll pause there, but really happy to be here and to take questions later on.
Thank you so much, April. And we're also joined again by the director of the Irving Institute for Energy and Society, Elizabeth Wilson. Do you want to say hello, Elizabeth?
Hi, everyone. We're just so excited to have this virtual 101 happening and really looking forward to the conversation today. Thanks, everyone.
Great, thank you. All right, so let's get started. And again, welcome. And we're sorry again that we couldn't be in person, but we will be finding a time to bring you all into the Irving building when it's open. We're really excited about that. It's happening soon. It's looking great. So keep an eye out for more information on that. But again, this week, we're going to get started with allowing you all to kind of chat amongst yourselves a little bit and get your brains going and kind of think of some more great questions for our guests so we can have a really great conversation when you come back. So we're going to send you to breakouts. And for our first breakout, we're going to ask you to kind of think about the 3 videos that we watched this week. So our 3 videos were on climate innovation, energy finance, and energy policy. So in your breakouts, think about after watching these videos, what connections did you discover among these 3 topics? You know, how are they related? So go ahead and we're going to send you into your breakout groups and have a great chat, and we'll collect some of your thoughts when we get back. Great. All right. Well, I hope you had a good discussion in there, and we would love to hear some of your thoughts. Would anyone like to share any kind of interesting connections between our topics that came up in your breakouts? Feel free to raise your virtual hand or pop something in the chat. All right. Well, maybe it sparks some questions that you'd like to ask. So we're going to start with our Q&A. But if there's anything that that comes up thoughts that you'd like to share, please feel free to jump in, raise your hand. And we'll start with some of the questions that were pre-submitted. And again, if you have questions that come up, go ahead and raise your virtual hand or pop it in the chat, and we'll get to those questions. So let's start with a question on energy finance for April. And then David and Elizabeth, if you have thoughts to share on this, please jump in. So April, one of the things that you mentioned in your video was something about green banks. So can you elaborate a little on how green banks function?
That's a great question. And I think at the end of the day, I was actually looking through as I was getting a sense of the questions to pull together some additional resources because there's a lot more than there used to be 10 years ago. And I know David and Elizabeth will, please feel free to jump in here. But, you know, there's now the American Green Bank Consortium and, you know, a few others who are really sort of coalescing around some resources that would be great for you to follow up on. Because back in the day, maybe there was the Connecticut Green Bank, which is already rounding out its 10th year in operation. But now there are so many more. I'd say at the end of the day, the most sort of succinct example or description is, you know, they're financial institutions just like regular banks, but their sole purpose is really to leverage public funding to attract private capital with the specific intent to fund clean energy projects. So a lot of them have a triple bottom line. They're focused on, you know, a return on capital. Maybe it's a little bit of a longer time horizon, but they're also you know, focused on doing good for the environment and for people. The other really big benefit is it raises awareness and creates, I think, different innovative structures for how to deploy finance in clean energy sector. So it's a little bit faster, right? Because it's typically in the past been government funded or government subsidized, which can be kind of a lengthy process and very data, you know, document heavy process, and really green banks are helping to create awareness in communities that these sort of access to this type of capital exists, and to really put forth good thinking around projects that can be developed locally. So it's really about helping to create some structure, I think, for the people who are interested in funding projects like this, as well as the people who need to receive funding in order to do the good work at the most hyper-local level. So it's really supposed to be a more efficient way to deploy money and find, you know, all of this costs money in a way that is de-risked. It is crowdsourcing the people who are needing the projects to be financed, as well as the folks who are looking to put that money to good use in clean energy projects. So I'll stop there, and hopefully that's a good enough beginning explanation to spark some more conversation.
Great, thank you so much, April. David or Elizabeth, did you have anything to add to that before we move on?
So maybe I'd add a larger point is that I think green banks show the intersection of government and private finance. And it for me, it kind of illustrates what the role of government and what green banks are, which is to be catalytic capital, is to fund things that are on the verge of being mainstream and financeable by your average bank, investment bank, venture capitalists, but to build a track record and show that they're bankable. And for me, that's one of the important things to take away from this, is that government and private finance are partners, but government has probably the early role and perhaps the most important role to prove that these things are bankable. Whether that be, you know, green hydrogen, anaerobic digesters. I think there was a big success story at the Department of Energy where, through the work of the Loan Programs Office, a $76 billion program, they proved out the utilities solar market in the US were basically the uncle that lent $465 million to Tesla to allow Tesla to become Tesla and buy their first facility, as well as doing a number of other kind of large renewable projects.
I just want to point out, this week in class, we were talking about energy insecurity. And we had Ted Tribune, the head of the DC Energy Efficiency and Sustainability Utility, as a guest speaker. But the readings we read were Tony Reams and Sydney Forrester and Tony Reams talking about kind of where money for energy efficiency actually goes. And some of these programs analyzed who wasn't getting the money. And it was oftentimes communities of color and disadvantaged communities that weren't getting the energy efficiency finance, even though the money was conceivably available for everyone. And in the paper with Forrester and Reams, they did a really nice analysis of the Michigan area and looked at what they called the efficiency gap. If you're rich enough, you have the money to do the projects on your own. If you're poor enough, you can qualify for government assistance and aid. But there is a gap in the middle of people earning between 80% and 120% of the area's median income, where they didn't actually have the cash to put in their investments in the energy infrastructures. And the series of articles really made me appreciate that sometimes for big projects, we're having very, very different conversations than we are for communities, than we are for residential customers or small commercial businesses. And so just as we're thinking about policy design, as we're thinking about green banks, appreciating that there are people across the income stream that may not have the credit to access traditional capital, but still have the need when it comes to saving energy.
And I could go on and on. You and I have talked about that ad nauseum, Elizabeth. Like, how do we think about getting ahead of that problem? You know, greater energy efficiency codes, greater building energy efficiency codes, state policy that keeps up pace, right? How do we build more efficient buildings as a whole, you know, as we're managing also
enforcing building codes. We have lots of codes that we just don't ever enforce.
Absolutely, but shifting that cost upfront to the homeowner or renter or the occupant, you know, it feels not equitable. Yeah, absolutely.
All right, thank you. So I think we have a couple of comments and questions that came in the chat. So I want to get to those next. Angus, do you mind reading those off for us?
Well, I'll start with memories, as they were talking about some of these equity issues. So I'll just read out the whole thing. John in memory talked a bit about equity issues that come from individuals leaving the grid to try more efficient systems on their own. Early adopters of technologies, for example, solar, end up driving demand and thus lowering the cost. How do we balance the short-term inequity caused by striking out on one's own with the long-term benefit of making new technologies more accessible? Was a question she had for y'all.
Yeah, feel free to jump in on that, April, Elizabeth, or David, if you have thoughts on that. Go ahead, April.
I was just unmuting, but I mean, I have a lot of thoughts on this. I'm sure David and Elizabeth do as well. I mean, it's a problem. There's really no other sort of way around it. One of the really important things for us to note, though, is in sort of business model innovation and also like the technological innovation, I think, that we're seeing, right? And policies and regulations have to keep up with that. So, you know, I'm sitting in Louisiana and we had a big prolonged grid outage because of Ida, and then there were, you know, wealthy homes and, you know, areas where they just had generators on site, right, or solar that could disconnect from the grid and power the house, but at the same time there was an opportunity to power your neighbor or the neighbor next to you, right? And so I think as we're like looking at how we need those early adopters to help drive the cost down, we need adoption curves, you know, to also facilitate broader access. We can't sort of pay a premium for these things forever, but it's kind of back to the comment I just made about how do we build more efficiently? How do we do it at the beginning instead of forcing everyone to do it sort of, you know, post facto, where we're going back and retrofitting everything. At the same time, there is a need to retrofit a lot. And how do we do that in an equitable way? And I think that, you know, I think one of the other questions is about just innovative financing structures that allow low income or lower income, you know, I'll say homeowners, but even in my own personal experience running our sustainability committee's efforts around this, we can't just focus on homeowners. It's people like college students, it's people who don't own their homes. How do we think about also creating structures where the community is also thinking about community development projects that help to either install on some of these facilities or assist, you know, residents in accessing the types of credit facilities they would need to install. But we have to show, you know, at the end of the day that it pays off. Most people can't afford to pay their utility bill and their solar loan, which is also another thing that we don't talk a lot about. So even if you're able to access the capital, you know, you can't pay 2 bills for the months that you're not offsetting your usage. So anyways, I think there's a lot that has to be done in the redesign across the entire system, from how our buildings are built to where solar is installed, potentially even looking at distributed technologies that allow for us to share in a more communal neighborhood-based sense, as well as thinking about ways to free up access to capital to enable everyone to equally and proportionally access the technologies. And I won't get into rate design because that's a whole nother issue, but the cost shifting when folks are coming off is something we could talk about for hours.
And maybe just to answer Memory's question, is to think a little bit about these big concepts. One is socialization of costs. So we live in a world that is largely a centralized grid. And before there was things like grid defection, the utility death spiral, we all paid our fair share. But now there's an ability for people to essentially create islands for themselves. They can create their own microgrid at their home. Wealthier people can have generators. They'll have their Tesla Powerwall panels, et cetera, et cetera. So how do we figure out how we can create a more just and equitable world? And I think that goes to a lot of points that April raised. But I think there's also, you need to redesign what the business model utility is. Right now, the business model utility was to build big projects and make anywhere from 7 to 12% off that. What I hope that the future of the business model utility in the United States is that they're being paid for things like efficiency, being paid for resilience. They're being, so for lack of a better word, they're seen as a giant battery that everyone can draw power from when their own distributed systems, maybe the sun's not shining, the wind's not blowing. But again, these are really big questions. And hopefully one day we'll all be able to meet in person over a cup of coffee and we can talk about this ad nauseum.
All right, thank you.
Yes, well, one of the reasons I just put in a link to the regulatory systems projects, electricity regulation in the US. It goes step by step. It addresses a lot of these issues in detail that April loves about rate design and other stuff. But just as a reference for all of you, it's fabulous. It really is something they give to new public utility commissioners to help them understand the system, because a lot of them aren't coming from the electricity system. But many of you have questions about how does the system work, how does the system change, and this document tells you. And so it explains how renewables get on. It explains this idea of storage and all the other. But your questions about equity are ones that I think about a lot as well. It's great to people to be able to have these microgrids, but not when the rest of the world doesn't have reliable energy. So thank you very much for that.
All right, thank you. So we have some questions also about climate innovation here, and I want to get to those, but I think first, I think we're going to send you back into breakouts for another quick breakout so that you can kind of get your own thoughts around climate innovation before we actually hear a little more from David on that and from April and Elizabeth as well. So we're going to have you go back into another quick breakout group. And I want you to kind of give some thought to the end of David's video, where in the end of his interview, he talked about some of the reasons to kind of be optimistic about our potential to transform our energy systems and mitigate climate change. But we would love to have you think a little about what gives you the most hope that we can transform our energy systems to be more just and sustainable. Or what do you think are the most important steps that we can take, either on a personal or regional or national scale, to support energy transitions? So we'll put that prompt in the chat for you when you get into your breakout groups, but go ahead and get together and share your thoughts a little on that for a few minutes, and then we'll come back and we'll talk a little more about climate innovation. All right, I hope that was another good discussion. And you enjoyed chatting with each other. We would love to hear some of your thoughts. You had some really great thoughts and questions that came out of the last breakout group. So thank you for sharing those. And we're going to get back to those too. But does anyone want to share any thoughts from this breakout group? Anything interesting that came up that you'd like to share with the group? Feel free to raise your hand, or if you want to save it and throw it in the chat and we can get to your questions as we go, feel free to do that as well. Okay, we have one question that came from the breakout groups from folks who are interested in hearing more about leapfrogging in developing countries. So I don't know if that's something that you can speak to, David.
Okay, so right now, to grossly simplify things, we live in, there's a global north and a global south. The global north have basically built an energy economy based on fossil fuels and centralized planning. The future of the energy system will not be based on fossil fuels and will not be centralized. They'll be resilient, distributed, smart, and low carbon. As many countries and companies and states in the global south, as they're building their infrastructure, they can make the choice to build it like in the way of the future, or they can follow our model. And I think many people are trying to push them to go follow the model of leapfrogging us. And instead of going, let's say using the telecom example, let's not have them buy a rotary phone as their first phone. They should jump to smartphones. And this is the same thing about the new power plant in their state or their region shouldn't be a coal-fired power plant. It should be a combination of battery, solar, and wind. And that's kind of how I'd like to talk a little bit about leapfrogging. There are many, many other examples around energy storage, smart grids, dumb grids, but I think that's a good way to start. Anyway, thank you, Alex, for asking the question.
Okay, thank you, David. April or Elizabeth, did you have anything to add to that before we move on to the next question?
Sure, that was a great description. And I think important to note that, it's exciting that we think of sort of developed and developing countries as like binary, but as David really sort of walked through the opportunity that leapfrogging presents itself, what it means is that we actually have an opportunity to also learn from countries that aren't sort of beholden to that incumbent way of doing business or developing technology. And as they're developing new innovations that leapfrog what we've done over the past 100, 150 years, we actually get to learn from those innovations as well. And so, there's a really fun example in Morocco where I lead one of our student trips for Tuck, and we look at some innovative financing models for clean energy and capital deployment. For clean energy, large scale, city scale renewable development. For electric power and for water desalination and for heating, including utility scale storage, not batteries, but storage. And they have come up with really interesting ways to finance where government's part owner, the private sector's part owner, they're really getting the investment of the local community involved at all phases of the project and really able to build much larger projects at really enormous scales in, probably a third of the time that we would be able to do in the US. Now I'm, skirting a lot of details, but the interesting thing is just the opportunity to not think about it as like a better and a worse or a good and a bad. But, as David mentioned, you wouldn't pick up and install a rotary phone if you know that smartphones exist, right? It's the same with the mobile banking and things like that. We're seeing that like vastly deployed in many other parts of the world that don't have this incumbent sort of institutional framework to start from. So it's an opportunity for the developed world as well to also now learn from the innovations that we're seeing through the leapfrogging. So that's the only comment I wanted to add.
I guess I feel a little bit differently. I see that we have people, about almost 800 million, without access to electricity. But then there's a big middle. And the middle is there are the people that have power now. It might not be reliable, it might not be enough. And then there's the rich world, the 2 billion of us that have almost too much energy and have expectations for reliability and supply. And a lot of those people in the middle, like China, like India, do have centralized big plants and big grid infrastructure. And so I appreciate this hope and this vision of distributed futures. But when I look at where investment dollars are going in the world, from China to Africa to build out infrastructure projects, they do tend to be pretty large. They're not building. And so there is a lot of talk and hype about microgrids and this and that. But when you look at actually what's being built and what multilateral development banks are financing, the walk hasn't yet caught up with the talk. You see some differences. There's lots of beautiful demonstration projects, and the projects that April mentioned in Morocco, they're amazing. They're absolutely amazing. And so there are these incredible bright spots in the world where we're really talking about doing things very, very differently. But I just want to caution the idea that this is an inevitable future that is happening this way because it is, has to happen this way. It might be the case, but I just appreciate that our technological systems are oftentimes, people get mad at me when I say this, but it's like a bad rash. Like in some places, you really see old legacy systems hanging on. People are using power plants like Dartmouth from many decades ago, even though there's better alternatives available. And so, as we're thinking about system innovation and change, figuring out where change is easy to have happen and how we can support it is as important as figuring out where things are sticking and better understanding how we can do that. I mean, the politics of energy in the coal regions of China are really different from the coasts. And so even within a country, you can think about different ways to have these conversations. So I just want to be a little more nuanced than saying this is the inevitable pathway forward and it makes sense for everybody, because I think empirical evidence doesn't necessarily support that assertion right now. So, and I'm happy to have pushback and have the conversation with all of you as we go forward on this.
I think you raised two really good points. One is the idea about energy justice and energy poverty. There are 800 million people in the world who say don't have access to energy. And if they have an option to get, let's say, power from natural gas, you know, who are we to say they shouldn't have lights? They shouldn't have a refrigerator. They shouldn't have all these things that we view as essential in, you know, in the global north. But I think the one other thing, just making it a bit more nuanced, you know, the low carbon revolution is not just a distributed revolution where you have panels in everyone's house. It's also about doing gigawatt utility scale, solar, wind, you know, and ideally geothermal in the future. And these will also be, you know, centralized. But the one difference between that and how we build our energy system, which is mostly under coal and natural gas, is that there weren't things like batteries. Grids were dumb. They only went one direction. The grid of the future, whether it's distributed or it's more centralized, will have to be able to move energy back and forth. It'll be relied just as much on bytes as it does on electrons. And anyway, we can go into this ad nauseum, but there's, you know, this for maybe this is my call out. We should maybe do an energy 202. Anyway, but great points.
Great. Thank you so much. All right, so let's try to get to a couple more questions. I want to take maybe one or two more on climate innovation, and then I think we have some more on energy finance, so we'll get back to those too. So David, we had a question that came in earlier about climate innovation, asking if you see any opportunities for change in areas of food waste or agriculture.
So I think this current kind of climate tech revolution means there's opportunities in every industry. Food and ag is one of them. I personally believe in every industry will be a Tesla, whether there's a Tesla for meat, which may be Beyond Meat or Impossible Foods, or there's going to be a Tesla for concrete, which might be Sublime System, which is using electrochemical processes to make concrete. So to answer your question, yes, yes, yes. But to be a bit more specific, there are huge ways where you need innovation in the world of big food and big ag. It's more than just recycling waste. It's things around having big data, precision agriculture, regenerative agriculture, putting the value of carbon in soils, all these things. Again, I think right now climate is being lumped in one giant bucket, but in reality, climate is many things. Energy, water, ag, finance, mobility, and each of these sectors are gigantic. But because climate is the new thing, people tend to lump into one, but each of them requires, to be honest, specific sector expertise. I hope that answers your question.
All right, thank you. Anything to add on that before we move on? All right.
I'll just one sentence, and that is when I'm thinking about innovation, I want to make sure we're not just thinking about technologies, but we're thinking about technological systems. That's it.
Great, thank you. But we do have a question that is specifically on technology. So let's get to that one quickly, and then we'll talk some more about. But maybe that will spark some more questions. So thank you, Elizabeth. So I think there was a question in the chat that had something to do with carbon capture. So David, I don't know if you can speak just a little bit to that as a potential climate innovation and the value of that technology.
So carbon capture, and I think what the person asking the question was specifically talking about direct air carbon capture. So there are two types of carbon capture. One where you're essentially capturing all the carbon dioxide that's coming out of a stack from a power plant or some industrial site. The other is direct air capture, which is literally you're taking carbon dioxide, which is at 417 parts per million from the air, and then somehow capturing it and then sequestering it. if we are going to be on a path to 1.5 degrees Celsius, which means keeping our planet habitable, we need to do that. But the carbon management, the carbon capture industry, it's a gigantic opportunity. It's something that, if it reaches potential, will be the size of what the oil and gas industry is today. And yeah, so it's very, very important, you know, depending on whose kind of techno-economic analysis you're looking at, it's either a few gigatons or 10 gigatons a year of abatement will be coming from direct air capture. There are a number of really great companies that are now in there. I think, you know, Elizabeth brought up Carbon Engineering is one. And they're right now doing what's very important is they're building their first pilot plants where they're doing thousands of tons a year. But the question is, how do we get them from doing thousands of tons a year to millions of tons a year? And then from millions of tons a year to billions of tons a year. And that's where we kind of touch on some of the other questions about scaling and how can we both innovate and scale at the same time. And it's not a either or question, it's both and.
Great, thank you. All right, so let's, unless there's anything to add on that question, let's shift back to energy finance because we have some more questions in here about that in our last few minutes. So we had a question that came in earlier, and then there's another question in the chat that I want to get back to. But one of our questions that was submitted earlier, April, is there are many institutions in the US that have been pressured towards divestment in areas where their institution has directly played a role in financing and financially investing in the fossil fuel industry. So do you see divestment as another important aspect of energy finance?
This is a really good question. Hot topic, even here at Dartmouth, I think as many of you probably know. And I think it's a really important question to be asking. And, you know, I would say yes, bottom line, yes. It is important to be thinking about sort of where your money, where your investments, where investments are being funneled and what they support. And that goes down to sort of the mechanics and the thinking around corporate values and the materials and the products that companies make, you know, that we consume. But in addition to divestment, I think it's important that we recognize our own opportunity as consumers to think about individual divestment. So it's not a one-sided sort of, you know, show. You need two sides. If you really want to make a statement, I think consumer behavior, consumer choice is the loudest voice we have, because you see companies certainly making different decisions when their products are no longer in demand. And so I do see a lot of talk around divestment. I think it's an important tool in the toolkit. It's important to be educated about it and around it. But I also like to talk about it in the context of sort of our own duality by thinking about the opportunities for divestment, but while also maybe living our lives the way that we did yesterday, as opposed to thinking about changes we may make as consumers. And it's important to make sure that we're thinking about them in both contexts. So I don't know if that's helpful framing.
All right, great. Thank you so much. David or Elizabeth, did you have anything to add to that before we move on to our next question?
I would just add, like, again, you know, if the only tool I think it's important to have a breadth of tools. And I think divestment is one to communicate to companies that following, you know, high carbon intensity business models is not supported by the capital markets. But I think it's also important to do engagement. So I think what engine number one, which is a small hedge fund that basically put 3 board members onto Exxon, that's a game changer. And this will be the first of many more, I would say, green gentleman activism, where companies where activists will try instead divest and say, no, we're not going to invest in you, saying we're going to invest in you, but we want change.
Great, thank you so much. All right, so we have another question in the chat that I'm going to pass it over to Angus to read that one off. Thank you, Angus.
Yeah, of course. Aaron was wondering, do you think we need more money going into research and development to lower costs or to put more money towards funding implementation of some of these new energies?
We were talking about this a little bit, I think, at the break while you guys were in breakout, and kind of thinking that it was a both and. So I can speak to, David mentioned the DOE loan programs office and, some of the appropriate roles or lack thereof of the government and government funding or tax dollars. And the answer is you kind of need both. But really, when we talk about money generally, I just want to be specific about whose money, whose capital. So it's different who's funding R&D, right? Maybe that's out of a corporation's budget versus our tax dollars going to pay towards implementation or R&D. If you think about it from the government's perspective, my personal view after working in the government, but also just realizing that our market-based economy kind of necessitates that companies eventually thrive on their own. We have to be careful about the limitations of where we want government funding to stop, and really the market to sort of spur, kick in and take over, because what we want is thriving companies that are self-sustaining and not necessarily completely relying on government funding to operate. And so I think when we talk about implementation, the government's role is to really spur technologies to market and shorten the timeline at which it takes to get, especially the super early stage R&D that's not fundable, that really is not beneficial for really anyone there, but it's impactful to us, right? For maybe an environmental reason. That's a great use of government funding to collect all the best experts, convene the private sector, convene the public sector, convene, the variety of stakeholders, and really spur the acceleration of the deployment into, hopefully, into the market. And that's a really great place to sort of balance, the need for funding with R&D, but maybe where, depending on who the funding is, the question is being asked. I don't know the specifics, but kind of knowing where maybe you don't want it to carry forward. So maybe there's some of that early stage capital to get it up in the implementation, make sure it's sustaining, but you really want a sustainable business model that allows for, an efficient deployment of capital, and some version of a return so that the company can keep operating. I don't think taxpayers would want to be funding implementation in perpetuity.
Thank you so much, April. So I see that we are at time. So David and Elizabeth, I just want to give you a chance if you have any final words that you want to share, or April also, if you have any final thoughts that you want to share before we wrap up.
I think the one thing I'd like to say is that right now, the challenge to keep our planet at 1.5 degrees Celsius of change is an epic one. And we need everyone's talents and energies involved. And I think for me, the most important thing I learned from working at the White House is a call to action. So you guys are now listening to us talk, but what are you going to use this information for? Are you going to do a startup? Are you going to go try to pass a bill? Or are you going to work at a big company and try to change it from the inside? Will you create a grassroots effort? In all you guys, there's a potential to be, the next Greta or next Elon Musk. And I hope that, a few years from now, we can say, oh, we knew him or her then.
Great, thank you.
That was great. I just wanted to thank everybody, including April and David and Megan and Amanda and Angus, and Stephanie and Melissa for making this happen. This is our 5th time teaching Energy 101, and it's just been an incredibly rewarding conversation to be part of, to meet people through. So I just want to thank everybody for playing with us. And we look forward to seeing you on campus when the new building opens, which they said we were moving in, come to us in springtime, and we'll try and do something. But again, thank you everyone for playing. This has just been fabulous. And thank you, April and David, for participating today.
You got it. And I'll be very quick. I'll just say that, as David said, this is the most interesting time. I've been at this for about 20 or so years, and it couldn't be a more interesting and exciting time to be in this space. And I hope that all of you feel excited about some version of what you're hearing throughout this program, but we need everyone in every capacity, wherever you are, in whatever phase of life. And so the best thing that I think you're probably hearing is it's complex. It's now sort of every company's business. And you can attack this from really any angle. And so all of your interest areas, don't ever think that it doesn't intersect with climate or environmental sustainability, because it does. And I can assure you, we work with companies that I would never imagine would be focused on these issues. So the opportunity is everywhere. You just have to ask. And I'm so thankful that all of you are participating. And thank you to the Irving Institute team for allowing me to be here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you again to April and David for joining us. and for the whole Irving team for everything, for making this happen. And thank you all for joining us. We're going to be following up with you, so stay tuned. We will follow up about when we're going to get you into the building, and also about the raffle drawing for folks who have attended all of the sessions, and also some of those incentive prizes for folks who registered early. We're going to be getting those out to you soon. So you will be hearing from us again, and we'll be passing on, a recording of this. And please feel free to reach out to us if you have any other interest in energy. Please feel free to reach out or take a look at the website. We have lots of seminar series and things like that coming up. So please keep in touch, and you will hear from us soon. And we will let you go now that we are 4 minutes over time. I'm sorry, but everyone enjoy your evening, and we'll be in touch. Thank you again to everyone.
Okay, thank you, Megan, for arranging all this.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.